So I dug back into some sociology books to look a few things up, and some of the phrasing reminded me of a pet peeve that I had when I was encountering sociology in my undergrad, and that is, I call it sometimes the emphasizes or the emphasis epidemic, which is this tendency to describe sociological theories as primarily in terms of like, oh, this theory emphasizes this while this other theory emphasizes this other thing. Now, this is not necessarily false a lot of the time, but it is misleading because it leads to a particular simplistic view of of what some of these theories are actually contending. And in particular, when it comes to the two, if you're new to sociological theory, there's kind of two umbrella theories: functionalism or structural functionalism on the one hand, and then its exact opposite, conflict theory. Now, each one of these consists and breaks down into a lot of different specific ideas, but broadly speaking, these are kind of like the two poles of sort of like the sociological theory spectrum. And the way the textbooks will describe it is structural functionalism emphasizes harmony and how society consists of interconnected parts and how fundamentally society is a functional whole. And then conflict theory emphasizes how, there's disharmony or obviously conflict, and that's what characterizes society fundamentally. Now, it is true that these theories do emphasize these things, but it's more accurate to say that they are fundamentally at odds with each other as to the nature of conflict itself. Okay, so it's not that functionalism simply talks about harmony and conflict theory simply talks about disharmony. It's more fundamental than that. It's that functionalism basically makes the argument that society, that hierarchy in society, that stratification in society, that elite rule in society is, for lack of a better word, a good thing. That is what a society needs. That is the only thing keeping society together. That's the only thing that keeps the mob from kind of ruining things, so to speak. Now, of course, I'm being very crude in my phrasing here. That is not how, that's not something that the theorists would necessarily say, but that is in effect what they are saying, right? So when there is disharmony in society, things like, for example, riots or some sort of breakdown, what the theorists of functionalism would say is that that is a type of dysfunction arising within a basically functional system, and it needs to be corrected so that way sort of the good parts of elite rule can be restored, right? So it's almost like a disequilibrium that then is corrected and becomes a new equilibrium, right? Whereas the conflict theorists, on the other hand, they're making the argument that society is fundamentally rigged. Okay, it's a rigged system. It is not fair. Elite rule is unfair. Elite rule needs to be, overthrown. And these theories are basically emancipatory for that reason, right? So the idea here is that that when there is a conflict in society, which is, they would argue all the time, whether it's interpersonal or between different social groups or whatever, political parties, whatever, etc., it actually is symptomatic of deeper sort of cleavages within society that are there sort of by default, right? Society is fundamentally like an uneasy alliance between people and groups who basically do not, in a way, do not like each other. And each one is trying to get their way, right? And so this is where you get theories like, Marxism, some varieties of feminism, some varieties of race-based theories, etc. But essentially, conflict theory is of that. It is making the case that society is basically rigged, and it needs to be, that needs to be undone in some way, right? So that is basically the sort of the spectrum of sociological theory, right? And that's the point that matters. That's the distinction between the two poles. So it's not just that one side emphasizes this and another side emphasizes the other thing. That makes it sound like it's just a matter of interest or a matter of, how they see things or whatever. It's that these are fundamentally contradictory ideas that cannot be resolved you know, because and I point this out because sometimes you see students who are like, oh, I take a little bit from this bucket and I take a little bit from that bucket. I'm kind of in the middle. I split it down the line, etc. Now, sure, there might be some forms of that make sense, but it's important to realize that you're operating within a fundamentally binary system. So functionalism and conflict theory really are quite fundamentally at odds with each other, not just because of what they stress or what they emphasize, but because of the way that they understand what conflict means. For functionalists, conflict is a disorder of a basically good system, and it needs to be corrected so that way elite rule can persist. Whereas for conflict theorists, the conflict is symptomatic of a basically rigged dysfunctional system that needs to be overthrown, right? And that is kind of like, if you understand that that is the basic spectrum of sociological theory, then you've really come much of the way towards kind of understanding it. Then you have a pretty good foundation for the rest of it. Okay, so yeah, just wanted to get that little rant off my chest.